I was standing barefoot on my back porch at 6 in the morning, half awake, clutching a certified letter from my HOA, when all hell broke loose behind me. The air was filled with furious honking, someone yelling in panic, and the unmistakable sound of chaos erupting in a place that was supposed to be my private sanctuary. I hadn't even finished my coffee yet. I looked down at the letter again. Official letterhead, legal language, lots of bolded words, demanding unrestricted access to my fenced backyard for routine inspections. They expected me to just unlock my gate and smile. What the HOA didn't expect was that I would comply in the most literal, creative, and honestly satisfying way possible. Because instead of rolling over, I turned my backyard into what the responding police officer later described as an active goose hazard. I'm a quiet homeowner in a tightly controlled HOA neighborhood in Red Willow Creek, Ohio. I keep to myself. I value privacy. That backyard was the one place the HOA hadn't managed to stick its nose into until they tried to take it outright. What started as a single demand spiraled into police visits, emergency HOA meetings, city officials getting chased off my property, and an HOA president being publicly humiliated by her own rules. And if you're wondering how it escalated that badly, stick with me. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? When my wife and I bought this house, the backyard was the deciding factor, not the kitchen, not the square footage, not even the price. It was the tall wooden privacy fence and the quiet space behind it. 6 solid feet of wood separating us from the world. After years of apartment living and noisy neighbors, that fence felt like freedom. I work from home full-time, and my wife juggles work and the kids, so that backyard quickly became our pressure valve. The kids played back there every afternoon. We grilled on weekends. Some evenings, I'd step outside just to breathe and listen to nothing at all. No cars. No neighbors. No HOA nonsense. At the time, the HOA seemed harmless. The neighborhood in Red Willow Creek, Ohio, looked picture perfect. Clean lawns, trimmed hedges, polite smiles. During closing, the HOA documents were thick, but nothing stood out as alarming. The board introduced themselves with friendly emails about trash pickup schedules and holiday decorations. For the first year, everything was smooth. Then, slowly, almost quietly, things started to change. It began with little warning letters. One about my trash cans being visible for too long after pickup. Another because my grass was apparently a fraction of an inch too tall, even though it had rained for 3 days straight. Then came the drive-by inspections. I'd notice a car crawling down the street at odd hours, stopping briefly in front of houses. Neighbors started whispering about fines, threats, and letters that used a lot of bold text and vague legal language. At the center of all of it was Linda Carver, the HOA president. Linda had been on the board for over a decade, and she treated the bylaws like a personal instruction manual for everyone else's life. She had a way of speaking that made everything sound like a command disguised as a favor. "We're just trying to keep standards up," she'd say, while handing out violation notices like party favors. People were scared of her. I didn't realize how scared until later, when neighbors admitted they avoided eye contact with her just to stay off her radar. For a while, I managed to stay invisible. My front yard was tidy, my house was neutral, and my backyard, hidden behind that fence, was none of their business. Or so I thought. Everything changed the morning the certified letter arrived. It was thick, formal, and full of language that sounded important but felt deliberately confusing. According to the letter, my backyard sat on what the HOA called a critical drainage pathway for the neighborhood. Because of this, they claimed they needed ongoing access for inspections, maintenance, and monitoring. The letter stated that my locked gate was now considered an obstruction. I was instructed to remove the lock entirely or leave the gate unlocked from 8 in the morning to 6 in the evening on weekdays, indefinitely. I read it 3 times, waiting for the part where it explained when this had ever been discussed before. It never did. No easement was mentioned, no diagrams, no prior notice, just a demand. I was stunned. That fence was the whole reason we bought the house. The idea of HOA members or contractors randomly walking into my backyard while my kids were playing or while I was on a work call felt invasive in a way I can't fully explain. It wasn't just inconvenient, it felt wrong. So I did what I thought was reasonable. I emailed Linda and asked for clarification. Politely, calmly. I asked where this drainage issue was documented, whether there was an easement on file, and why this had never been brought up before. Her response came fast. Too fast. She didn't answer my questions. Instead, she reminded me that the HOA had broad authority to maintain community infrastructure and that refusal to comply could result in daily fines and legal action. She ended the email with a line that stuck with me. Homeowners who cooperate rarely have problems. That wasn't reassurance. That was a threat. I pushed back gently, pointing out that there was no easement recorded with the county and that unrestricted access to my backyard posed safety and privacy concerns for my family. That's when Linda escalated. The tone shifted from curt to hostile. She warned me that the board could authorize forced access if necessary and that my gate lock was now considered a violation. Within days, I started hearing from neighbors. Quiet conversations by mailboxes, text messages sent late at night. People telling me, in hushed tones, that Linda had tried similar things before. That once she decided something was necessary, she didn't stop until someone backed down or moved away. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about drainage. This was about control. And Linda had finally decided my backyard was next. I realized then that if I didn't draw a line, that fence, and everything it represented, was going to become meaningless. And once that happened, the HOA wouldn't stop at my gate. I tried to handle it the normal way first. Emails, phone calls, calm questions. I figured if I stayed reasonable, someone on the board would eventually realize how ridiculous this was and walk it back. That assumption didn't last long. My follow-up emails either went unanswered or came back with the same copy and paste responses. Phrases like, "The board has authority," "community safety concerns," and "non-compliance will result in enforcement." No one addressed the easement issue. No one explained why this drainage problem had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It felt like I was talking to a wall that had learned a few legal buzzwords. Then the threats started. First, it was fines. $100 per day for gate obstruction. Then a warning about potential liens if the fines went unpaid. Then vague mentions of legal action, all carefully worded to sound terrifying without actually committing to specifics. Every message ended with the same not-so-subtle pressure: comply now, or this will get expensive. What really pushed things over the edge was when Linda stopped hiding behind emails. I was working from home one afternoon when I noticed someone standing near my fence line. I stepped outside, and there she was, arms crossed, clipboard tucked under one arm, sunglasses on like she was inspecting a crime scene. She didn't knock. She didn't call ahead. She just stood there, waiting. She told me, very calmly, that the board had discussed my resistance. She used that word, resistance, like I was staging a rebellion instead of asking basic questions about my property rights. She said it would be a shame if things escalated unnecessarily. Then she leaned in slightly and said something I won't forget. Homeowners who work with us usually have an easier time here. It was pure intimidation, polite on the surface, threatening underneath. I told her, again, that there was no easement, that my family used that yard daily, that unrestricted access wasn't acceptable. She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said, "We'll see what the board decides." After she left, I sat at my desk staring at my computer screen, unable to focus. For the first time since moving in, I felt anxious in my own home. I started running worst-case scenarios in my head. What if they really did find me into oblivion? What if they put a lien on the house? What if fighting this cost more than backing down? That fear is exactly what they count on. I started talking to neighbors more seriously. Quiet conversations, always looking over shoulders. One neighbor admitted Linda once fined them for a mailbox decoration she personally didn't like. Another told me about a couple who challenged a rule and suddenly found themselves cited for every minor violation imaginable until they gave up. Someone else said they stopped attending HOA meetings because Linda would single out anyone who questioned her in front of the room. The pattern was impossible to ignore. This wasn't a board enforcing rules evenly. This was one person using the HOA as leverage to control people. And once she decided you were difficult, your life became miserable. The more I learned, the angrier I got. Not loud anger, the quiet kind that settles in your chest and hardens. I wasn't trying to break rules. I wasn't trying to be difficult. I just wanted my family's privacy respected. And yet here I was, being treated like a problem that needed to be corrected. The emails kept coming. The language got sharper. Final notice. Failure to comply. Next steps. Still no proof. Still no explanation. Just pressure. One night, after the kids were asleep, my wife and I sat at the kitchen table going over the numbers. How long could we realistically fight this? How much would a lawyer cost? What if the HOA dragged us out for months or years? The stress was starting to bleed into everything. Work, sleep. Even weekends didn't feel relaxing anymore. But every time I thought about giving in, about unlocking that gate and letting strangers wander through our yard whenever they felt like it, something in me pushed back hard. Once you give up something like that, you don't get it back. And I knew, deep down, that if I caved, Linda would see it as permission to keep pushing. The final straw came when I received another message stating that the board was considering options for accessing the property regardless of homeowner cooperation. Forced access. They actually put it in writing. That was the moment the illusion shattered completely. This had never been about drainage. There was no emergency, no infrastructure risk, no sudden environmental concern. It was about power. About proving that the HOA could tell me what to do on my own property, and that I had no choice but to accept it. And once I understood that, I stopped thinking about how to comply. I started thinking about how to protect myself. I realized pretty quickly that trying to out-email the HOA was a losing game. Every message I sent just gave them another opportunity to repeat the same vague threats, and every day I spent arguing was another day they counted on me getting tired and backing down. So instead of firing off another reply, I picked up the phone and called an old friend of mine named Mark. He's not a property lawyer, but he's spent years working in corporate contracts, and, more importantly, he knows how liability actually works when people start throwing around words like authority and access. I laid everything out for him, the letters, the threats, the lack of an easement, the demand for an unlocked gate. He listened quietly and then said something that completely changed how I looked at the situation. If they're insisting on entering your property, he said, then they're also insisting on taking responsibility for whatever happens when they do. That stopped me cold. Mark explained that HOAs love to talk about access, but they hate liability. If someone from the HOA or one of their contractors got hurt on my property while entering without an easement, that wasn't automatically my problem, especially if there were warnings posted, especially if the conditions were known, especially if the entry wasn't truly an emergency. The more he talked, the more I realized the HOA was trying to have it both ways, total control with zero risk. That conversation sent me down a research rabbit hole. I started looking beyond the HOA bylaws and into city and county ordinances. Linda and the board kept acting like the HOA rulebook was the final word on everything, but it wasn't. Municipal law still applied. Zoning still mattered. And buried in the local code for Red Willow Creek was something I never expected to find. The zoning allowed residents to keep a limited number of waterfowl on private property, not pets, livestock. As long as they were properly enclosed, cared for, and not used for commercial purposes, it was perfectly legal. There were limits on numbers and basic sanitation rules, but nothing extreme. I read it twice just to be sure. Then I went back to the HOA rules and combed through them line by line. They had pages about dogs, sections on cats, clauses about reptiles and exotic animals. But poultry? Not a single word. No mention of geese. No mention of ducks. Nothing. That was the moment everything clicked. I sat there staring at my screen, feeling that strange mix of disbelief and excitement that only comes when you realize the rules don't say what someone swore they did. The HOA had built its authority on the assumption that no one would ever check beyond their paperwork, and here was a gap they'd never bothered to close. Still, I hesitated. I wasn't looking for revenge. I didn't want to be that guy. I didn't want to start some petty neighborhood war over technicalities. All I wanted was my fence, my privacy, and a little peace. But every memory of Linda's threats came flooding back. Every dismissive email. Every neighbor who whispered instead of speaking up. Every line about forced access. I asked myself a simple question. If I don't push back now, when does it stop? That's when I understood something important. This wasn't about being petty. It was about setting boundaries that came with consequences. The HOA didn't respect polite objections. They didn't care about reason. The only thing they seemed to respond to was risk. So I stopped arguing and started planning. If the HOA wanted unrestricted access to my backyard, fine. I would give it to them. I would unlock the gate. I would follow their demand to the letter. But I would also make sure that anyone who chose to step into that yard did so fully aware of what awaited them and fully responsible for their decision. By the time I shut my laptop that night, I wasn't anxious anymore. I was ready. And the HOA had absolutely no idea what was coming next. Once I committed to the plan, things moved fast. There was no point in half measures. If I was going to draw a line, it needed to be clear, legal, and impossible to ignore. The first step was finding the right kind of animals. Not pets, not decorations, but something that naturally defended territory better than any lock ever could. That's how I ended up at a small farm about 30 minutes outside of Red Willow Creek. The owner didn't even blink when I explained what I was looking for. He laughed, leaned against the fence, and said, "You want geese, trust me." He explained that geese aren't aggressive for no reason. They're protective. Once they claim a space, they treat every unfamiliar person as a threat. Loud voices, fast movement, clipboards, tool belts, all of it triggers them. And the best part? Under local law, they weren't pets at all. They were livestock. I purchased the maximum number allowed under zoning and arranged transport the same day. When they arrived, it didn't take long to realize I'd made the right choice. The moment they were released into the yard, they spread out naturally, patrolling the fence line like they'd been doing it their entire lives. Anyone who thinks geese are harmless has never watched one lock eyes with a stranger. Next came the infrastructure. I hired a local contractor to reinforce the fence and make sure there were no gaps. The goal wasn't to let the geese escape. It was to make sure anyone who entered had to fully commit. I mounted multiple signs along the gate and fence, big, bold lettering, impossible to miss. Warnings about aggressive waterfowl. Clear statements that entry was at your own risk. I documented everything with photos and receipts. Then I did something that felt deeply satisfying. I emailed the HOA. I informed them that the gate would remain unlocked during the hours they demanded. I confirmed that the yard now contained legally permitted livestock. I noted that warning signs were posted and that anyone entering would be doing so with full knowledge of the conditions. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I simply stated facts. The response from Linda came quickly, and it was exactly what I expected. She laughed it off, called it childish, said I was bluffing and that the HOA would deal with it during inspection. She insisted animals weren't allowed, despite never pointing to a rule that actually said that. The tone was smug, dismissive, and confident. That confidence only told me one thing. She hadn't read the ordinances. She hadn't done the homework. She assumed I would fold. As inspection day approached, the tension in the neighborhood became almost physical. Neighbors whispered. Some avoided my house entirely. Others shot me looks that were a mix of curiosity and concern. I could feel the pressure building, but instead of anxiety, I felt calm. Everything was documented. Everything was legal. The decision to enter the yard would be theirs. The geese settled in quickly. They learned the boundaries. They learned the sounds of the neighborhood. And most importantly, they learned who belonged and who didn't. By the night before the inspection, the yard was quiet, the signs were posted, and the gate was unlocked. All that was left was to see whether the HOA would finally listen or walk straight into the consequences of their own demands. Inspection day arrived quietly, which somehow made it worse. No emails, no last-minute warnings. Just a line of unfamiliar cars creeping down the street a little after 8 in the morning. I watched from inside, coffee going cold in my hand, as Linda Carver stepped out of her sedan like she was walking onto a stage. Clipboard tucked under her arm, sunglasses on. Confidence dialed all the way up. Behind her was a young guy I'd never seen before, maybe mid-20s, clutching a notebook and trying very hard to look official. An assistant, I assumed. The kind of person sent along to witness compliance and take notes. They stopped at my gate. I could see Linda reading the signs, all of them. The big yellow one warning about aggressive waterfowl, the smaller one stating, "Enter at your own risk." The laminated notice explaining that livestock were present on the property. She paused just long enough for me to think, maybe, just maybe, she'd reconsider. She didn't. She turned to the assistant, said something I couldn't hear, and gestured toward the latch. The gate, exactly as demanded, was unlocked. From my porch, everything felt unnaturally still. No honking, no movement. The geese were there. I could see them scattered across the yard, but they hadn't reacted yet. It was like the calm before a thunderstorm, that strange quiet where the air feels heavier than it should. The assistant hesitated. He looked at the signs again, then back at Linda. She rolled her eyes and waved her hand, clearly annoyed. He took a breath, opened the gate, and stepped inside. Linda followed. For about 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then one of the geese lifted its head. That single movement set everything off. The honking erupted all at once, loud and sharp enough to make my chest tighten. The geese charged as a group, wings flared, feet slapping against the ground. The assistant froze completely, eyes wide, clipboard dropping from his hands. Linda shouted something, maybe his name, maybe a command, but it didn't matter. The geese were already in motion. Chaos exploded across the yard. The assistant screamed and spun around, trying to retreat, but Linda was right behind him, and the gate was suddenly too far away. One goose lunged, snapping its beak inches from his leg. Another rushed Linda directly, forcing her to stumble backward. She shrieked and scrambled onto my patio table, knocking over a chair in the process. From where I stood, it was surreal. Honking echoed off the fence. Linda was yelling for help, waving her clipboard like it might somehow protect her. The assistant ran in tight circles, slipping on the grass, clearly panicking. Every time one of them tried to move, the geese closed in tighter, loud, and relentless. Someone yelled, "Call the police!" I couldn't even tell who said it. Neighbors started appearing at windows and doorways, drawn out by the noise. A couple of them stepped onto their lawns, phones already in hand. I stayed where I was. I had warned them, repeatedly. The signs were clear. The choice to enter had been theirs. Linda's voice cracked as she screamed for someone to do something. The assistant managed to reach the gate and slammed it shut behind him, locking Linda inside with the geese without even realizing it. The look on her face when she realized she was trapped was pure panic. She climbed higher onto the table, clutching her clipboard to her chest like a life preserver. Sirens sounded in the distance. That's when the knot in my stomach tightened. Up until that moment, everything had gone exactly as I expected. But once police get involved, things can turn fast. I started running through scenarios in my head. What if someone got seriously hurt? What if this was spun as reckless? What if the HOA tried to twist this into negligence? The geese continued patrolling, honking, and pacing, daring anyone to make the next move. Linda kept yelling, alternating between demanding help and threatening consequences. The assistant stood outside the gate, pale and shaking, staring at the chaos he'd helped unleash. When the police cars finally pulled up, the entire street felt frozen. Doors open. Officers step out. Radios crackle. One of them looked at the signs. Another looked at Linda standing on my patio furniture, surrounded by furious birds. For a long moment, no one said anything. I realized then that this could still go either way. This could end with the HOA backing off completely, or it could spiral into something far worse than any of us expected. The first officer out of the car stopped short the moment he took in the scene. Linda was still perched on my patio table, hair disheveled, sunglasses gone, clutching her clipboard like it was a flotation device. The geese were spread out below her, pacing, honking, wings half raised, clearly in no hurry to leave. The assistant stood outside the gate, pale and shaking, talking a mile a minute before anyone even asked him a question. The officer raised a hand to quiet everyone down and did something that instantly shifted the balance of power. He walked straight to the gate and read the signs, all of them, slowly, out loud. He nodded, then looked at the latch. "Gate was unlocked?" he asked. "Yes," the assistant said quickly. "That's what the HOA demanded." The officer looked at Linda. "Ma'am, did you enter voluntarily?" Linda started shouting immediately. She said she was attacked. She said the homeowner had set a trap. She said the animals were vicious and dangerous and needed to be removed immediately. Every sentence got louder, more dramatic, more desperate. She waved her arms, nearly losing her balance, and accused me of endangering the entire neighborhood. The second officer walked the fence line, eyes scanning the yard, the signs, the animals, the enclosure. He asked about an easement. Linda snapped that the HOA had authority. When asked to provide documentation, she didn't have any. No papers, no map, no proof. Just confidence and volume. "That's not how this works," the officer said calmly. He explained, clearly, firmly, that without a recorded easement or emergency condition, the HOA had no automatic right to enter private property. He pointed out that the animals were contained, the warnings were posted, and the entry was voluntary. The geese, while aggressive, were not illegal. They were doing exactly what territorial animals do when strangers enter their space. Linda lost it. She started demanding arrests, demanding citations, demanding that the geese be removed immediately or destroyed. She exaggerated what had happened, claiming she'd been chased for several minutes and nearly seriously injured. The officers exchanged a look that said everything. The more she talked, the worse it sounded. One of the geese honked loudly, almost on cue. The officer turned back to Linda and said something that felt like a gavel hitting wood. "Ma'am, this is a civil matter. You were warned. You chose to enter. We're not intervening." The silence that followed was heavy. The assistant stared at the ground. Neighbors had gathered now, some openly watching, others filming. Linda looked around like she was waiting for someone, anyone, to back her up. No one did. The officer told her to exit the yard slowly and calmly while they monitored the animals. When she finally climbed down and moved toward the gate, the geese parted just enough to let her through, honking the entire way like a mocking escort. Once she was out, the officer spoke to me briefly. They confirmed everything I already knew: no laws broken, no citations issued, no action taken. One of them suggested, politely, that if the HOA planned further access attempts, they should consult legal counsel first. Linda stood off to the side, red-faced and shaking, while the officers left. That should have been the end of it. But Linda wasn't done embarrassing herself. Later that afternoon, she tried to escalate again by contacting the city, insisting inspectors needed emergency access due to sanitation concerns. The response came the next day. The city reviewed the situation, noted the animals, the warnings, and the lack of documentation, and canceled any planned inspections citing unsafe conditions. They recommended the HOA resolve the issue internally. That decision spread through the neighborhood faster than anything I'd ever seen. People talked. The story grew. Did you hear Linda got chased by geese? Turned into, did you hear the police sided with the homeowner? Turned into quiet laughter every time her name came up. The authority she'd relied on for years cracked in a single morning. By the end of the week, neighbors who had never spoken up before started comparing notes. Stories came out. Patterns emerged. People realized they weren't alone. They'd just been afraid. Linda stopped sending emails. When she did show up in public after that, she avoided eye contact. The confidence was gone. The clipboard stayed tucked under her arm instead of wielded like a weapon. For the first time since this started, I felt something close to relief. Not because I'd won, but because the truth had finally caught up to her. She demanded access without authority, ignored warnings, and walked straight into the consequences of her own overreach. The HOA hadn't been defeated by yelling or lawsuits. It had been undone by its own arrogance and a yard full of very well-informed geese. The fallout didn't come all at once. It spread the way embarrassment always does, quietly at first, then all at the same time. Within 48 hours of the police visit, the HOA sent out a notice calling for an emergency board meeting. No agenda listed, just a vague line about recent events and community concerns. That alone told me everything I needed to know. The meeting was packed. I'd never seen so many neighbors in one place since we moved in. People who had avoided HOA gatherings for years suddenly showed up, arms crossed, faces tight. Linda sat at the front like she always did, but something was different. The clipboard was gone. The confidence was gone too. She looked smaller somehow. Once the meeting started, the dam broke. Neighbors spoke up one after another. People I barely knew shared stories that sounded painfully familiar. Threats over minor issues, fines that made no sense, intimidation dressed up as enforcement. One man described how Linda had tried to access his property years earlier without notice. A woman talked about being fined repeatedly until she stopped questioning anything. Each story added weight, and each one pointed back to the same pattern. Then the board's legal advisor spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone directly. He simply laid out the facts. The HOA had exposed itself to massive liability. There was no easement, no emergency. The police report made that clear. The city's refusal to inspect made it worse. He said the words that finally shifted the room. This did not need to happen. All eyes turned to Linda. She tried to defend herself, claimed she was acting in the community's best interest, blamed misinformation, blamed the homeowner, me, for being uncooperative. But it didn't land. The room had already moved past her. People weren't afraid anymore. The vote came quicker than I expected. Linda was removed as HOA president that night. Not narrowly, not after hours of debate. It wasn't even close. When the result was announced, no one cheered, no one clapped. There was just a collective exhale, like a pressure valve finally releasing. Within a week, every fine related to my gate was officially dropped. The HOA sent a carefully worded notice stating that procedural updates were being made to clarify access policies. They didn't apologize. They didn't mention geese. But the message was clear. This fight was over. Life slowly returned to normal. The drive-by inspections stopped. Emails became polite again. Contractors knocked before entering yards. Some even called ahead, asking about the signs like they were local landmarks. The fence stayed locked. The gate stayed closed unless I opened it myself. And the geese? They became legends. Kids asked about them. Neighbors laughed about the inspection that never happened. Someone even joked about putting them on the neighborhood sign. The birds themselves settled into routine, honking less, patrolling less, content in the space they'd claimed. More importantly, something else changed. People stopped whispering. They started talking. HOA meetings became discussions instead of lectures. Rules were questioned. Explanations were expected. The fear that had quietly controlled the neighborhood for years evaporated almost overnight. My backyard went back to being what it was always meant to be, a place of peace. A place where my kids could play, where my wife and I could sit quietly at the end of a long day, and where no one entered without permission. The HOA didn't lose because of animals or signs or clever planning. It lost because it forgot something fundamental. Authority only works as long as people believe in it, and once that belief was broken, it never came back. Looking back on everything now, it's almost funny how people fixate on the geese. That's the part everyone remembers. The honking. The HOA president scrambling for safety. But the truth is, this story was never really about birds. It was about boundaries. It was about what happens when someone in power decides your space isn't really yours anymore and assumes you'll stay quiet because fighting back feels intimidating. I didn't win because I was louder than the HOA. I didn't win because I embarrassed anyone or made a spectacle on purpose. I won because I took the time to understand my rights and stayed inside the lines of the law while the HOA stepped right over them. They relied on pressure, fear, and vague threats. I relied on facts, documentation, and patience. When those two approaches collided, the outcome was inevitable. My backyard is peaceful again now. The fence is respected. The gate stays locked. No one from the HOA has asked for access since that day, and no one ever will. The signs are still up, mostly as a reminder, not to others but to myself. That privacy is something worth defending. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that you don't need to shout to stand your ground. You just need to know where the line is and refuse to let anyone push you past it. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?